In the summer of 1823, on a shelf of dolomite limestone in western New York, a former schoolteacher named Nathan Roberts laid a single cut block of stone at the foot of a 60-foot wall of rock. That one block was the first of tens of thousands of cut stone blocks that would form the Lockport Flight, 5 locks climbing the Niagara Escarpment in a single staircase. 2 years later, the state of New York had built 83 stone lock chambers between the Hudson River at Albany and Lake Erie at Buffalo, raising and lowering loaded canal boats a total of 565 vertical feet across 363 miles of hand-dug waterway. Critics called it Clinton's Ditch. By 1825, the ditch was open, and a country that ended at the Appalachians ended no more. I have been reading the Canal Commissioner's reports and the Lockport Journal columns, and the story comes down to a handful of men whose names are cut into the record. The first is Nathan S. Roberts, born in July of 1776, the same month the country itself was born. He had no formal engineering training. By age 16, he was teaching school in Plainfield, New Jersey. He taught himself mathematics, taught himself surveying, and in 1816, Judge Benjamin Wright pulled him in as assistant engineer on the central section of the proposed canal. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. The second name comes off the brass capstone plate at Lockport itself. It reads, "First stone laid July 9th, 1823, by N.S. Roberts, engineer, and Samuel Horn, master workman. 2 contractors are named after them, O. Culver and J. Maynard. Samuel Horn ran the stone gang at the base of the escarpment." For everyone else on the work, the ledger gives a number, not a name. So how do you carry a loaded canal boat up a 60-foot cliff of solid limestone using nothing but cut stone, oak timber, hand tools, and the weight of water itself? That is the question Nathan Roberts had to answer in the summer of 1823. The answer he wrote in stone is still standing 200 years later. Start with the route. The canal ran 363 miles from the Hudson River at Albany west to Lake Erie at Buffalo. The Hudson side sat nearly at sea level. Lake Erie sat 565 feet higher. To move a boat across that rise, the engineers needed 83 lock chambers. Each chamber was a closed stone box, with a gate at the upstream end and a gate at the downstream end. Open the upstream gate, water rushes in, the boat floats up. Close it, open the downstream gate, water rushes out, the boat floats down. Each lock at the original canal lifted the boat between 6 and 12 feet. Add them all up, and you cleared the full 565 feet. Each original chamber measured 90 feet long and 15 feet wide. That was the inside dimension, the wet space the boat actually floated in. The chamber walls themselves were thicker. Cut limestone backed with rubble fill, set on a foundation of timber piles driven into the canal bed. A loaded packet boat in 1825 ran about 78 feet long and 14.5 feet wide. The fit was tight by design. Less water in the chamber meant less time to fill it, and time was money on the canal. The stone itself came from the cut. When the diggers reached the Niagara Escarpment in 1823, they were not digging dirt. They were blasting through hard dolomitic limestone, the same rock that forms the lip of Niagara Falls a few miles to the west. The crews drilled holes by hand, 2 men on a hammer, 1 man holding the drill steel and turning it a quarter turn between blows. They packed the holes with black powder, set a fuse, and ran. The blast threw shards of rock for hundreds of yards. Houses in the early settlement of Lockport were hit by falling stone more than once. Workers were buried under collapsing chamber walls. Some of the bodies were recovered, some were not. The Canal Commissioner's ledger gives a number, not a name. But the rock the blasting produced was the rock that built the locks. Samuel Horn's stone gang took the blasted dolomite and squared it into ashlar blocks. The rectangular cut stone you can still see in the chamber walls today. The work was done by hand with chisels, mallets, and straight edges. A skilled stonemason in 1824 earned roughly $1.25 to $1.50 a day on the canal, which was about double what a common laborer made on the towpath cut. A laborer working with pick and shovel was paid between 50 cents and $1 a day, with the higher rate when the ground was rocky and the cubic yardage came slow. Both men, the mason and the laborer, worked dawn to dusk through summers that ran into the 90s and winters that froze the cement before it could set. The masonry technique itself deserves a closer look, because it is the part most modern viewers do not appreciate. Cut stone in a lock chamber is not the same as cut stone in a house wall. A house wall holds itself up. A lock chamber holds water under pressure, and the pressure changes every time the chamber fills or empties. So the stone has to be cut so tight that the joints stay sealed when the chamber is full and stay sealed when the chamber is empty. That meant Samuel Horne's masons worked to a tolerance of less than a quarter inch on every face of every block. They used straight edges of seasoned oak, set the block on a bed of fresh hydraulic cement, then tapped it level with a wooden mallet, checked it with a plumb line, and moved to the next block. A trained mason set about 30 blocks a day. The walls of a single chamber required several thousand blocks. Multiply by 83 chambers, and you can see why the work took 8 years. The chamber bottoms were laid first, on a foundation of oak piles driven into the canal bed with a hand-cranked pile driver called a ringing engine. The piles were sawn off level, capped with oak planks, and topped with a course of large, flat dolomite slabs called the invert. The invert kept the chamber bottom from heaving when the water pressure rose and fell. Then the wing walls went up, course by course, each block bedded in canvas white's hydraulic cement. Every 10 courses or so, the masons set a longer block, called a bond stone, that tied the inner face of the wall to the rubble fill behind it. Without bond stones, the inner face would have pulled loose from the fill the first time the chamber emptied. With them, the wall stood as a single unit. The masons worked in a wet world. The lower courses of every chamber sat below the local water table, so the work pit had to be pumped continuously while the stone was laid. The state used hand-cranked chain pumps and, at the larger lock sites, ox-driven lifting wheels. 2 men on a chain pump could clear about 10 gallons a minute. A wet chamber pit took 20 men working in 2 shifts to stay dry enough to set stone. When the rains came in the spring of 1824, several chamber pits flooded, and a few of the lower courses had to be relaid. The state paid the contractors for the lost time, but the men on the crews lost wages on the days the work was stopped. The ledger entries for those days are blank. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, I am putting them into a series of books. The men nobody wrote a book about. The ones who built this country with their hands. Volume 1 is out now. Scan the code on your screen or click the link in the description. Then come back, because what happened next is the part most people never hear. The cement is the part most people miss. Without it, the locks would have leaked from the day they were filled, and the canal would have been a museum piece before it was a working waterway. The man who solved that problem was Canvas White. And the story of his cement is the reason the 83 chambers held water for 40 years. White was a young engineer who traveled to England in 1817 at his own expense, walked the British canal works, took notes, and came home convinced the Erie Canal would not survive without hydraulic cement. Hydraulic cement is the kind that sets and hardens underwater. Ordinary lime mortar will not. Underwater, ordinary mortar dissolves. White spent the next 2 years testing local limestone with a colleague named Andrew Barstow. They found the right rock in Madison County at Chittenango. Burned and pulverized correctly, it produced a cement as strong as the imported British product and far cheaper. Over 500,000 bushels of white cement went into the canal. It is the gray paste in every joint of every lock chamber from Albany to Buffalo. The cement plant at Chittenango was a working factory by 1819. Workers quarried the local limestone, broke it into fist-sized chunks with hammers, burned the chunks in vertical kilns fueled by cordwood, then ground the burned product into a fine gray powder using stone runners turned by water wheels. The powder was bagged in linen sacks and shipped by boat along the partially finished canal to the active work sites. By 1823, the Chittenango plant was producing several thousand bushels a week, which was enough to keep 80 separate stone gangs supplied along the entire route. White himself was never properly paid for any of it. He held a patent on the cement process, but the state contractors used the cement without paying the royalty, and White spent the rest of his life trying to recover what he was owed. He took the case to the New York Supreme Court and to the state legislature. He won small judgments. He never got the full sum. He died in 1834, broke, but the cement held. The chambers did not leak. 2 centuries after the work, you can stand in the original Lockport chambers and see White's gray cement still bonding the stones. Then came the gates. Every lock chamber had two sets of gates, one at the upstream end and one at the downstream end. The original gates were oak miter gates, the same V-pointed design used on European canals for 200 years. Two wide leaves swung together to form a shallow V that pointed upstream. When the upstream chamber held more water than the downstream chamber, the water pressure pushed the two leaves into the point of the V and sealed them shut. The harder the water pushed, the tighter the seal. No iron, no rubber, no machinery, just oak, hinges, and physics. Each leaf was framed in heavy oak timber and planked with more oak. The frames were assembled in workshops near each lock site by gangs of millwrights and ship carpenters who had been recruited from the Hudson River shipyards and the Lake Champlain boatworks. A single gate leaf weighed roughly 2 tons. 2 leaves per gate, 2 gates per chamber, 4 leaves per lock. 332 leaves across the whole canal. Each leaf was hung on iron pintles set into the stone of the chamber wall. The pintles themselves were forged at small foundries along the route, the iron coming up from the Adirondack ore beds. A trained tender could push a leaf open or closed with a long wooden beam called a balance arm. 1 man, 1 beam, 2 tons of oak. A trained tender could fill or empty a 90-foot chamber in under 10 minutes. 12 minutes was the published average. With 83 chambers on the line, a boat from Albany to Buffalo passed through every one of them. And the trip that had taken 6 weeks by wagon over the Mohawk Trail now took 5 days by canal. The valves that fed water into and out of each chamber were called wickets. A wicket was a small oak shutter set into the lower part of the gate, hinged at the top, held shut by water pressure. To fill the chamber, the tender turned a hand crank on top of the gate that lifted the wicket. Water rushed through the opening at the bottom of the gate and filled the chamber from below. To empty, the tender closed the wickets on the upstream gate and opened the wickets on the downstream gate. The chamber drained the same way it had filled. There were no pumps. There were no engines. Gravity and water pressure did the work. So Roberts had 83 locks to design across 363 miles, but the worst 60 feet sat right at the western end. The Niagara Escarpment was a wall. There was no detour. The canal had to go over it, or the canal stopped at Lockport. The escarpment is the geological cliff that runs east from Niagara Falls across western New York. At Lockport, the wall rises 60 vertical feet in a horizontal distance of less than half a mile. A single lock would have to lift a boat 12 feet at a time, and the cliff demanded 5 locks stacked back to back with no level water between them. That is what a flight is. The downstream gate of one lock is the upstream gate of the next. The chambers touch. Roberts went one step further. He built 2 parallel flights, side by side, one for eastbound boats coming down and one for westbound boats going up. 10 chambers and 2 staircases of 5. Boats no longer had to wait for the single chamber to cycle. Traffic could move in both directions at once. The design more than doubled the throughput of the worst bottleneck on the canal. Construction at Lockport began on the 9th of July, 1823, with the first cut stone set by Samuel Horne under Roberts' eye. The brass capstone plate that marks the spot names the contractors O. Culver and J. Maynard. The work took just over 2 years. 1,200 men on the rock, many of them Irish, working with black powder and chisels. I have walked the Lockport flight. The original 5 chambers are still there, the ashlar walls still squared, the cement still gray in the joints. The state replaced them with larger locks in the 1840s enlargement, and again with steel locks in 1914. But the original 5 sit beside the modern channel like a museum of how the work was done. The chamber walls at Lockport were laid in courses of cut limestone bedded in Canvas White's hydraulic cement. The first courses went down in the late summer of 1823. By the winter of that year, the lower chambers were closed in and the work shifted to the upper chambers, which sat higher on the escarpment and out of the worst of the standing water. The oak gates were framed in workshops at the foot of the cliff through the spring and summer of 1824. The pintles were forged at a small foundry in Lockport itself, set up that same year to keep the gatework supplied without having to haul iron up from Albany. By the late summer of 1825, the gates were hung, the chambers were tested, and the flight was ready for boats. Living conditions for the men on the Lockport flight were rough. Most of the Irish workers slept in temporary shanties thrown up at the foot of the escarpment, 2 or 3 families to a single timber building, board floors set right on the dirt. Food was issued by the contractors as part of the daily wage. A typical day's ration was a pound of salt pork, a pound of cornmeal, and a half pint of whiskey, which was considered an essential anti-fever measure in the swampy lowlands along much of the canal route. Children worked the smaller jobs, hauling water for the chain pumps, carrying tools, leading mules. Women cooked for the crews and laundered the work clothes. A whole shadow village grew up around each lock site. When the work moved, the village moved with it. The single biggest health threat was not the blasting. It was the disease the workers called the canal fever, which we now know was a mix of malaria and typhoid carried in the swamp water and the close shanty quarters. Whole crews went down in the late summer of 1819 along the central section. The work paused for weeks. The contractors lost money, the men lost lives. The state commissioners noted the deaths in the annual report by counting empty payroll lines, not by listing the dead. The ledger gives a number, not a name. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. By the spring of 1825, the Lockport chambers were structurally complete. The gates were hung, and the work shifted to testing. Roberts and Horn walked the flight together, filled each chamber in sequence, checked every joint for leaks, marked the few that wept, and had the masons repack them with fresh cement. By the end of summer, the flight passed every test. The Erie Canal was ready for its first through-traffic boat. On the 26th of October, 1825, a boat called the Seneca Chief locked through the flight on its way east, carrying a barrel of Lake Erie water that would be poured into New York Harbor 10 days later. The state called it the Wedding of the Waters. A line of cannons stretching the full length of the canal fired in sequence from Buffalo to Albany and on down the Hudson to New York City, the sound of one gun setting off the next, so that the message that the canal was open traveled the 400-plus miles from Lake Erie to the Atlantic in just under 3 hours. The country had never seen anything like it. The canal was open. The flight had held. Step back from Lockport and look at the rest of the line. The numbers are honest. 83 locks total, 565 feet of vertical lift, 363 miles of channel, 40 feet wide at the waterline, 28 feet wide at the bottom, 4 feet deep, 18 aqueducts to carry the canal over rivers and creeks. The longest aqueduct at Rochester carried the canal 800 feet across the Genesee River on 11 stone arches. Total construction cost, $7,143,000 from the New York State Treasury, with not $1 of federal money. The legislature had authorized the 7 to million figure on the 15th of April, 1817. The work began on the 4th of July that same year at Rome, New York. It was finished on the 26th of October, 1825. 8 years and 3 months from first shovel to wedding of the waters. The politics tell the rest of the story. The man who pushed the canal through the legislature was DeWitt Clinton, governor of New York from 1817 to 1822, and again from 1825 until his death in 1828. Clinton had been arguing for the canal since the early 1800s. The federal government had refused to fund it. President Thomas Jefferson had called the idea a little short of madness. President James Madison had vetoed a bill that would have helped pay for it. So Clinton went to Albany, persuaded the New York legislature to fund the whole thing from state revenues, and pushed the bond issue through. His opponents called the project Clinton's Ditch and Clinton's Folly. They predicted it would bankrupt the state. It did not. The tolls paid the construction debt in full within 9 years. By 1834, the canal was free and clear. Freight rates from Buffalo to New York City dropped from $100 a ton by wagon to $10 a ton by canal. Wheat from Ohio reached New York Harbor in days, not months. New York City passed Philadelphia and Boston as the busiest port in America. The population of cities along the canal route, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, exploded inside a single decade. Buffalo went from 2,500 people in 1820 to over 18,000 by 1840. Rochester went from a few hundred residents in 1815 to 20,000 by 1840. Syracuse and Utica grew at similar rates. None of that happens without the locks. Without the locks, the boat does not climb the escarpment, and Lake Erie does not connect to the Atlantic. The canal also reshaped American agriculture and American manufacturing. Before the canal, a bushel of wheat grown in central Ohio cost more to ship to a coastal market than the wheat itself was worth. So Western farmers grew what they could eat and sell locally, and not much more. After the canal, that same bushel of wheat reached New York City for pennies. Western land that had been uneconomic to farm became valuable. Towns sprang up along the canal route to grind the wheat into flour, salt the pork, pack the produce, and load it onto boats. The flour mills at Rochester ran around the clock by 1830. The salt works at Syracuse exported tens of thousands of barrels a year. The whole geography of American food production tilted west toward the lakes, and the canal was the spine that carried it east to market. Then there was the human side. By 1830, the canal employed thousands of men full-time as boat captains, deckhands, mule drivers, lock tenders, repair masons, dredgers, and toll collectors. Most of the lock tender jobs were held by veterans of the original construction. Samuel Horne's stone gang scattered to repair work along the line. Some of the Irish laborers who had blasted the escarpment stayed in Lockport, bought lots in the new town, opened taverns and stables and boatyards. Others moved on to the next big project, which by the 1830s was the Ohio Canal, the Pennsylvania State Canal, and the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. The Erie Canal had trained a workforce. That workforce built every major American waterway of the next 30 years. Nathan Roberts went on to that next generation of work. After the Erie was finished, he was hired by the state of Pennsylvania to design and oversee the lift locks of the Pennsylvania State Canal, which connected the Delaware River to the Ohio River across the Allegheny Mountains. The Pennsylvania project was harder than the Erie in several ways. The Alleghenies were taller than the Niagara Escarpment, the rock was harder, the weather was colder, and the budget was tighter. Roberts designed a system of inclined planes, which were essentially railed sleds that carried canal boats up and over the steepest ridges where lift locks would have been impractical. The Pennsylvania Main Line of Public Works opened in 1834 and ran for 20 years before being replaced by the railroad. After that, in the 1830s, he was hired by the federal government to survey a canal around the Muscle Shoals Rapids on the Tennessee River in Alabama. The survey work took him deep into the southern interior at an age when most engineers had retired. He worked steadily into his 60s. He retired to his Canastota estate in central New York and died there in 1851 at the age of 75. He is buried at Lenox Rural Cemetery in Madison County. The grave is simple. The man who designed the Lockport flight is remembered by a single line of carved stone over a quiet family plot. There is no statue. There is no monument. The chambers at Lockport are the monument. The original Erie Canal did not stay original for long. By the 1830s, the canal was already too small for the traffic it had created. The state began the first enlargement in 1835, widening the channel from 40 feet to 70 feet, deepening it from 4 feet to 7 feet, and rebuilding most of the 83 lock chambers at larger dimensions. The enlargement took 27 years and cost almost 8 times what the original canal had cost. At Lockport, the 1840s enlargement built a second, larger flight of locks parallel to Roberts' original 5, and most boats began using the new chambers. A few of the original chambers were left in place as a backup overflow. Those are the chambers that survive today. A second rebuild came in 1914, when the modern barge canal replaced most of the original alignment with deeper, steel-gated locks suitable for steam-powered tugboats and motorized barges. The new Lockport locks numbered 34 and 35, single chambers with concrete walls and steel miter gates, each lifting about 25 feet. Roberts' original cut-stone chambers, by then 90 years old, were left as a stair-step ruin beside the new channel. The city of Lockport spent the next century restoring the original flight as a heritage site. By 2020, the lower chambers had been repointed, the upper chambers stabilized, and a walkway built so visitors could climb the original 5 steps in person. The stone is still squared. The cement is still gray. The chambers Roberts and Horne built still hold water. Samuel Horne is harder to track. The record gives his name on the capstone plate at Lockport and his title as Master Workman. After the canal was finished, his trail goes cold. He may have moved on to another canal project. He may have stayed in Lockport. He may have died on the work and been buried in the local churchyard. The local records of the period are incomplete. What survives is the brass plate and the chambers he laid. I have run the wage numbers 3 different ways. A stonemason on the Lockport flight earned roughly $1.50 a day. A laborer on the towpath earned half that. Working a 6-day week, a mason cleared about $9. Across the 2-year build at Lockport, a man who held his job for the duration earned in the neighborhood of $900 total. That sum bought a small farm in western New York in 1825. For a young Irish immigrant who arrived with nothing, the Lockport flight was a path to land and to citizenship and to a name in a town record. For Samuel Horn, it was the brass plate on the capstone. For Nathan Roberts, it was a career that took him next to the Pennsylvania State Canal and then to Muscle Shoals on the Tennessee River, where his expertise became the model for the next generation of American canal engineers. For the men whose names the commissioners did not write down, the ledger gives a number, not a name, but the stone they cut still holds water 200 years later. The men who died on the work are honored in the same stone. Some were killed by black powder accidents at the rock face. Some were crushed by chamber walls that failed before the cement had set. Some drowned in the partially flooded sections during winter freeze and spring thaw. The exact count was never compiled by the state, and any number you read for total Erie Canal deaths is an estimate. But every chamber from Albany to Buffalo carries the work of men whose names are gone. The stones remember even when the paper does not. Look at what they built. 83 cut stone chambers, 565 feet of vertical lift. 363 miles of channel, cut by hand, through hardwood forest, swamp, and dolomite limestone. 18 aqueducts crossing rivers and creeks. A working hydraulic cement industry built from scratch in Madison County. A workforce of 1,200 Irish immigrants and a few thousand local Americans who taught a country how to do heavy civil engineering on a continental scale. The full canal cost $7 million and paid for itself in 9 years. It moved a bushel of wheat from Buffalo to New York City for 1/10 of what the same trip had cost by wagon. It made New York City the largest port in America. It opened the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, and every piece of it, the chambers, the gates, the cement, the towpath, the aqueducts, was cut and laid and hung by hand. I started this episode because I wanted to understand how a 40-year-old former school teacher with no engineering degree designed a 5-step staircase of stone up a 60-foot cliff and got it right the first time. The answer, after reading the commissioner's reports and walking the flight in person, is simpler than I expected. Nathan Roberts trusted his masons. Samuel Horn trusted his contractors. The state trusted the engineers. 1,200 men trusted the work. They built it by hand in 8 years for $7 million. And the canal they built changed the geography of the country. The locks they cut are still standing. That is the honor of the thing. Not that the work was new, not that the work was easy, but that the work was done right by men who knew they would never be famous and did the work anyway. The stones are the monument. The names on the capstone are the witness. The rest of us are here because they finished the job. One more thing before you go. Every name I find, every number, every record, I am collecting it all into a series of books, so these men are not forgotten again. Volume 1 is available right now. Scan the code on your screen, or follow the link in the description. See you in the next one.